My name is Sharon Koppel, and I am an art quilter. And one of your library volunteers is doing a videotape of me today in my studio so that people can see where I make my art quilts and what my quasi-organization of this usually messy space is. So I want to start by just kind of showing you around the studio. So my studio is actually my daughter's old bedroom, which has been converted. So we now have lots of flat surfaces. I have a cutting board, a cutting area here. Can you see this? I have a cutting area here, which is where I do most of my work. Quilts are a lot of, for art quilts anyway, they're a lot of putting pieces of fabric down and figuring out where you want them to go and doing creative cuts. My art is not the more traditional quilting where they make a lot of blocks that are often the same size and with the same designs. Mine is very much of a kind of create as you go. And in fact, yesterday I created a quilt and now it's in the pile that needs to be redone. So something didn't work and I was just getting started before Wendy came, but I will work on that later today. And that happens too. Sometimes you have to do some ripping and you do some restarting. But anyway, this table here is where I do most of my work. My cutter is my primary tool. And now I'm going to have Wendy turn around so we can see the fabric. And maybe you want to come back here to get kind of the full Monty of my fabric. So I have, I don't know, I'm going to guess around 700 or 800 different pieces of fabric. And I try to lump them by color. They're sort of organized right now. They were perfectly organized 2 weeks ago, but now they're getting sort of organized. A little bit about my background. I come from a quilting family. So my mom started quilting close to when she retired, and I have some of her old quilts, but she was doing a lot more work in traditional quilting, and she was a much more meticulous person than me. So she did great, beautiful quilts where you had to have the 30 squares that all matched and created patterns when you put them together right. I was not good at that, but I did learn a lot from her about technique and kind of ideas about color because she had a good color sense. I had started sewing when I was probably 8 or 9. My mom was a seamstress her whole life. My grandmother, her mother, actually had a cottage industry in rural Ohio where she made wedding party dresses, and she also made majorette outfits for the school district, all kinds of things like that, which it was her job. She earned a decent living doing that while my grandfather was involved in the farming business. So in 2010, when I retired, I bought some books about contemporary quilting and abstract quilting and landscape quilting, and I spent about a year making kind of the quilts that the book talked about. And most of those are folded up in my closet now. They were very nice quilts to start with, but I was looking for my style and looking for my design and looking for the things that I really wanted to do. And once I kind of figured that out is when I started moving into my own patterns and my own, I don't even call them patterns because they aren't patterns, but my own designs and approaches to quilting. So when people say, how did you learn to quilt? Well, you know, the first step is learning to sew and being a good sewer. I laughed because I started quilting with my $200 Singer that my parents bought me when I was a senior in college. And so that machine was 40 years old when I retired. And I found my mother's walking foot, which is really critical to good sewing when you're quilting. I found, because she had a Singer and she had bought a walking foot. So I dug through all of her things and I found this walking foot and I thought I had arrived. Well, it was about a year. I bought my first Bernina, and that was just a little guy. And then the second Bernina, which I teased my husband about when I bought it, I said, well, you know that mower you wanted? You're not going to have that mower this year. I bought a sewing machine instead. And there's a reason that Berninas kind of cost what they do, but they're wonderful machines, and I have not regretted a minute of having this Bernina. It's a specific quilter's model of a Bernina 750. In this part of my studio, which I didn't talk about while we were in here, is what's called a design wall. And a design wall for a quilter or a sewer is really nothing more than actually flannel tacked up on the wall. And mine is literally tacked up with thumbtacks. Anyway, this is where I put quilts up when I'm working on them. So I might put a couple pieces on, and the fabric just sticks to the flannel, so you don't have to do anything else. And I can stand back 10 feet, which is kind of the rule of thumb when you're designing or looking at anything, that you need to get back enough so that you can get a sense of how the colors and the piecing and all of that go together. So, but on my design wall right now, I have a quilt that I made probably, I don't know, like a year ago maybe. I've been interrupted a lot with custom orders, and so I'm just getting back to quilting this. And this is one of my sunrise tree quilts. So it's got a sunrise in the background and some mountains. It's got some water in the front, and it's got autumn and fall colors, which are some of my favorites. So this guy, I got the trees outlined with thread, and I've done the sky, but I haven't done anything else yet on my quilting. And this is probably a good time to talk about the quilting I do, because a lot of people who do traditional quilting have very precise designs that have to be perfectly put onto the fabric so that everything's the same size and it all matches and it's a very consistent pattern. My art quilts are not anything like that. So if you want to get a close-up shot of the sky, you can see that the lines are kind of all over the place. There's no like rhyme or reason to them. And I will also, when I start quilting these various mountains, I'll do different kinds of free motion designs so that each of the mountains stands out. And some will have a little more depth to them, and some will have a little less depth. Sometimes I don't quilt a section of the quilt, and I just let that plain, and it kind of gives a whole different kind of perspective with the quilt. So making that decision about what I do and how I quilt is something that happens as the quilt kind of develops and I'm in that stage of the design. Okay, one of the things I'm going to show you just as a really quick example is how I would lay out like an abstract landscape quilt. So yesterday I took time to figure out the strips of fabrics that I wanted to use and kind of what order they go in. And if you can take a picture of that, the first step in a landscape quilt is always kind of the background with the sky and the hills or mountains, whatever you want to call them. And then I start building it down. So typically what I do to figure out my color designs is I literally just start laying fabrics out to make sure that I get the kind of the color layout that I want, and I have, you know, some kind, I mean, you can tell there's a lot of different colors here. I am not a matchy-matchy person, and I don't hesitate to throw, like I told you with the red and the green quilt, I threw in a peach, and I never would have thought of that, except I looked at it in a picture, painting, and it looked great. So this one is going to have a variety of different colors that are going to all be put together in curves. And then it's going to end with some grays and blacks. Okay? And the fun thing about these is that I have no plan except for the hills. The hills are cut. Everything else is going to get cut as I go. I'll just make a kind of a curved cut, lay it down. If I like it, I sew it on. If I don't like it, I recut it. And that's some of the fun of abstract quilts. Now, it's very hard for people who like patterns. And I have people calling all the time. Do you have a pattern of that quilt that you made? It's like, no, but you're welcome to copy it. I don't care. I just want people to enjoy quilting. And so there's lots of mistakes. There's stuff that, you know, I have lots of bins of various sizes of the pieces that I cut off when I'm putting these on, because, you know, there's not going to be this size of black at the bottom. It's going to be much smaller, and there'll be a piece left over, and that piece gets put into the bin with the bigger pieces. Sometimes there's super small pieces. I have 2 bins of brown and 3 bins of green, large bins of fabric pieces underneath my cutting table, which is what I use for my tree quilts. There's enough fabric here for me to probably sew for 50 years and not have to go to the fabric store. However, I do keep going to the fabric store. So I'm going to show you how I do one of my curved piecings, the cutting and the sewing of it, because that's really kind of what's unique about my quilts. I'm going to work with the section of the quilt that has the, we'll call them rolling hills today. Okay, so this is kind of like you have to know which one goes in first. Obviously, the furthest mountain away goes in first. So, one of the cool things about sewing with curves is that you use what's called a wallpaper cut. And not being a wallpaper person, I didn't even know what this was, but this was one of the things I learned early on when I was teaching myself how to do all this stuff. A wallpaper quilt or wallpaper cut has you take two pieces, usually wallpaper, and you sit them both right side up and one on top of the other, because you want them to match when they go up on the wall. So you want two right sides together. Right sides together. You know what I mean. Right sides, one right side on top of the other right side. What I do then is I take my rotary cutter and I just follow the curve of the piece that I'm going to put in. Now I think my rotary cutter is ready to be changed, which is why it's there. It's cutting all the way through. Okay, so now this becomes a scrap that goes into one of my many bins. This will go into the light blue large bin full of scraps like this that I use on future quilts. So you can see this fits, this matches, okay? Now, the way you do a wallpaper cut sewing is that you flip the right sides so that they're together. And I usually just put one pin in so that I don't lose my spot on the way to the sewing machine. And you can see this is going to be you do like 3 or 4 stitches at a time to sew this curved piece in. And that's how every piece goes in. There's no big zipping straight stitches anywhere. Everything is gently matching it together. And it never matches perfectly, which is why I like quilting like this. Because you just cut it all square at the very end of the quilt and it all comes out looking fabulous. Next piece is going to be the next background mountain, and you always have to remember, there's going to be a seam allowance, so it's going to put it up a little bit, and so I have to get it in the right position. So now's when it feels like you're starting to hack your quilt apart, because you kind of are. So I take my cutter, and again I follow this pattern, or this piece, I shouldn't say, it's not a pattern, this piece, and yes, I'm cutting part of the quilt off with this rotary cutter that needs to be changed. Okay, so now we have this piece, and I would do the same stitching then. I would start it over here and curve it around as I'm sewing. And then this piece is done. And then this piece will go on. He's the last piece, and he comes across like that. And then I just keep building the quilt. Okay, so I have maybe 3/4 of an inch of right side to right side to get started sewing. So I do a little back stitch just to hold it there, and then we've done that little bit. Now you move the fabric a little bit more. Literally, it's about 3 or 4 stitches. Oh, we might get a whole inch in here. And then you pull it back so that you're just doing the right edges together. I know people that pin. I'm not a pinner. So if you are a pinner, I guess you could probably pin the whole thing together and then sew it, but I'll take my chances and just piece it together myself. I find this much more relaxing and easy to deal with than pins in and out. And you can see it's not quite going to make it, and that's okay. Okay, now we go over to the iron. So then you simply press this down. Would help if my iron was warmer. I think it turned itself off when we were walking around. You know, these irons with a brain. Come on, thing. Let's warm up. There we go. So there you have the first curved piece put in. Okay. Some of my quilts, usually my smaller ones, hang by the rings on the back. And sometimes with quilts, let me show you, probably, I don't know. Oh, this one back here might be an example. Sometimes they have two dowels, so they can hang either way. And like this one also has rings on all the corners. So you can hang it this way, or this way, or this way, whichever way you want. It's interesting because I often create, I always create the quilt a certain way when I'm designing it, but when I get it done, I often turn it around and look at it all different ways before I make the final decision, if it's not a landscape quilt that clearly has a sky and an up and a down. Because sometimes it gets much more interesting when you just do something simple like turn a geometric quilt upside down. One of the other designs that I like to do a lot is just curvy abstracts, which have tons of color in them and tons of movement. And this is a really good example of one of those. And this is also one of these quilts that has dowels on two ends and loops all over so that you can turn it around and hang it different ways. And I really kind of market that with buyers with, you know, this becomes 4 quilts because it looks completely different when you turn it upside down or turn it even just 90 degrees. But these are terrific fun to do because this is just like playing with colors in the old studio. it's a blast. This is another example of some of my earlier designs, which are more geometric. I love working in geometrics. This is one example of a geometric. Let me show you another one behind it. That's another example of kind of an abstract geometric. And you can see there's no patterns to my designs. So they're very much created in my studio as I'm putting colors together and fabrics and shapes and things like that. I love geometrics. Geometrics, interestingly, don't sell real well. So I've moved away from making too many of them unless somebody calls and makes a custom order. I do make them for my own house, though, because I just enjoy them so much. Now, another design that I do a lot of is abstract landscapes. And this is an abstract landscape that my goal with abstract landscapes is really to get colors. Kind of the colors that you might see in a landscape. Again, with lots of curves and lots of movement to just, I want the fabric to be able to speak almost as if it was paint. So picking the right fabric is really key, and it will sometimes stop me, making a quilt if I have not the right, design or fabric that I want. But that's also why I have like 800 or 900 different fabrics in my studio, so that hopefully I do have the right fabric. So this is another design I've done a lot of, and in fact, the quilt that I'm giving to the library is an abstract landscape. A third one of my designs that I've been making a lot of lately are what I call my red poppies. And this is actually a bit different. I usually have red poppies that just have a couple single flowers on them with usually a blue or a gray background. A friend of mine had a stained glass, a small stained glass hanging in her house. And I said, oh, I really like the curves and colors of that. And so I took a picture and I came home and I made kind of my own design from that. But one of the things that's unique about my art quilts, especially these poppies, is that these are all pieced. So a lot of times people will make quilts like this, but they will do what's called raw edge adhesion or raw edge fusion. And so the pieces are actually just cut out of the fabric and fused on with the iron and then sewn on top. Mine are all pieced. So this is pieced just the way your grandmother would have made a quilt when she puts her squares together. And it takes some careful planning to figure out how to put the pieces in so that it's a pieced quilt instead of an applique quilt. Another new design I've started working on is what I call my silly birds. And these are not pieced. These are applique. So this is a rough edge applique. I think about 2 years ago, I was just tired of doing really involved quilts, and I said I wanted to do something fun and easy for a while. And I started making these bird quilts, and they have been selling like hotcakes. And so I kind of get into a groove where I'll make like 5 or 6 of them and then put them on my shop and let those sell. And then 6 months later, I'll make 5 or 6 more. So these are really just a whole bunches of silly colors and all kinds of different free motion quilting, which I haven't talked about yet, but we will. And then just, you know, goofy legs and goofy beaks.